Warning, there will be spoilers in this video regarding events throughout the game, except for the ending. Upon successfully getting topside to Upper Junon, I found myself moseying through a corridor, constructed with thick, slanted glass windows. The corridor was dark, only lit by the sunlight that penetrated through the glass windows from the opposite side. It was up so high, you could see the ocean, as well as the untraversable, rocky, mountainous terrain, characteristic of the Junon region. And, off in the distance, atop the mountain, sat a silhouette of a giant bird. The great condor. Except, it wasn't just sitting. It was breathing, and would occasionally spread its wings to stretch, bringing life to the silhouette. This moment felt so convincingly real to me that I could see my mom looking down at me smiling with fascination and excitement, pointing to the great condor, telling me to look, and exclaiming, "Wow, look how big he is! Isn't that cool?" As if I was still a child. While Final Fantasy VII Remake was a more grounded, linear experience, this moment while I was playing Rebirth made me realize that playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth feels like a vacation. A 155-hour-long vacation, that is. That moment is such a small part of the game, and is likely something most players didn't take the time to notice, but it hit me in a very nostalgic way that's hard to articulate. But it felt like a trip to the aquarium when I was a kid. But it's not just that moment. It's almost the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that gives off this vacation vibe. The tropical beach of Costa del Sol, the cruise ship, the gold saucer, Cosmo Canyon, all of the mini-games, and especially the character interactions along the way contribute to this feeling. Going into Rebirth, I had some concerns about how they were going to handle this section of the game, considering I found the original to already have some pacing issues, and expanding that to an entire game could easily get boring. So the question is, did Square Enix alleviate this concern of mine, or did they exacerbate it? And also, how does Final Fantasy VII Rebirth stack up against its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII Remake? Well, in short, not only does the game feel like a vacation, but it's very good at being an overachiever as well. In addition to teasing a lot of things coming for Part 3. But that's just a part of what we're here to discuss in this sort of kind of review, if you want to call it that. Well, let's start by talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake then. It's been a little over 4 years since the release of this game, and this might be a bit bold to say, but I think enough time has passed since then for me to officially say Final Fantasy VII Remake is my favorite video game of all time. And you might be looking at me thinking, this kid didn't grow up with Final Fantasy, so of course he might think that. Except, I'm actually a lot older than you think. I happen to be 32 years old. Which means I was 28 when Final Fantasy VII Remake came out. By the time you're in your early to mid-20s, it's pretty hard to definitively give a video game the label of your favorite video game of all time, because every game has to compete with the games of your childhood during your most formative years, when all of your video game experiences were completely brand new. You might be able to objectively say a new video game is better than the games you played as a kid, but it's hard as an adult to place that game in a personal, special place. The place you would call your favorite video game. However, at age 28, I felt like there was a new game to put in that spot, and it was Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, I could gush about the game for an hour, but there will be plenty of time to do that in later videos down the road on this channel, so if you want to see that, do me a little favor and give that subscribe button a braver for me. The point of me mentioning this is to set the stage for the kind of lofty standards Rebirth has to live up to. My favorite video game of all time. Now, one of the things that has largely remained the same from Remake to Rebirth is the combat system, and that's definitely not a bad thing, and is what I would expect from a direct sequel. The game uses what I would call an action command battle system. Y'all have probably finished the game at this point, so I don't need to explain how all the basics of the combat system work, right? Okay. The most notable additions to the combat system in Rebirth are synergy skills and abilities. Synergy skills can be executed by holding the R1 button in combination with a face button. Did I use these skills? Not really. Are they useful? Probably. I mean, I started a hard playthrough and that Mithril Golem fight was near impossible without utilizing Iron Defense, it seemed, but during my normal playthrough, I don't recall using them much, so I can't comment on it as much as I would like to. The synergy abilities, on the other hand, oh yeah, did I use them? They're basically like additional limit breaks and can do things like increase your limit level, grant free MP usage for a time, and increase the duration of a stagger. These are very useful, and sometimes, even if the added bonus effect it gives isn't necessary, I often found myself utilizing them when I was in a pinch at times. And when you consider how many characters there are in this game, and how many combinations of synergy abilities there are, it's insane how the devs pulled all of this off in just a few years. The other notable change is aerial mobility. This time, you can no longer just automatically perform aerial attacks if the enemy is airborne. The controls are a bit more restrictive. However, there is a greater range of mobility while airborne. Characters can essentially dodge mid-air, and many of the weapon abilities are designed to combo mid-air attacks together, allowing you to be able to stay airborne much longer, especially with the addition of some attacks specifically being able to launch foes into the air. Ultimately, from what I found, aerial combos might be visually cool to pull off, but it didn't make the battles all that much easier. Using the same kind of tactics as the first game, such as exploiting elemental weaknesses, buffing characters, pressuring and staggering, is where the focus truly is. Will they focus more on that in Part 3? Especially with all the weapon fights that will likely be coming? We'll have to find out. Now, I talked about how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth doesn't have any jumping in a different video that I released before Rebirth was actually released. And I still think it's a pretty relevant video, so you can check that video out above. Naturally, the 4 characters from Remake have returned. They all mostly play the same as they did before, but with just a few adjustments and some new abilities. Most notably, Aerith's Radiant Ward, which is cheap as fuck, and I didn't utilize it nearly enough during my normal playthrough, but I am finding myself using it more post-game. And then they changed Cloud's operator mode animation to just basically make him even more of a fucking badass. And then there's the 3 new characters, Yuffie, Red 13, and Cait Sith. I was already acquainted with Yuffie's playstyle from the Intermission DLC, and she largely plays the same as well. She's very weak defensively, but is otherwise a sort of jack of all trades in that she has ranged abilities, close combat, physical, and magical abilities. She is great at adapting to any situation, but isn't always the optimal character for the task. Red 13's playstyle is interesting. He's kind of like a tank with benefits, but also sacrifices. By guarding with Red 13, you build up this Vengeance gauge, and then if you press triangle, he'll go into Vengeance mode. He won't be able to guard during this mode, but his offensive abilities improve, and most importantly, you get access to certain weapon skills that are useful, which becomes more apparent the further into the game you get. My personal favorite is using Supernal Favor, which grants haste to everyone in the party. This is basically like using haste and magnify materia together, but without having to waste a precious magnify materia, as those are pretty hard to come by in this game, and without needing to take up 2 materia slots for it. And Cait Sith also has a very unique playstyle. His main shtick is summoning the big fat Moogle. He's not particularly useful by himself, but while riding the big Moogle, he packs one hell of a punch, and also dramatically increases the stagger gauge. You can also choose to mount or dismount the Moogle to your heart's desire, and if you dismount, the Moogle still participates in combat and can even act as a sort of decoy tank as it has its own HP. So it will remain in battle until it is killed, in which case you would need to expend another ATB to summon it again. The Materia System is of course still intact with most of the materia from Remake coming back, but with a few new ones. I really found use of the combined elemental materia like the fire and ice materia, as well as the lightning and wind materia. It's basically just a materia slot saver, as you only need one slot to be able to cast both of those magic spells, but it also saves you even more additional slots if you plan to combine them with blue materia, such as an elemental materia, which previously would have required one fire mixed with elemental and one ice mixed with elemental, which would have required 4 materia slots. But you can now achieve the same result in 2 slots by simply combining the fire and ice materia with an elemental.
Bam! There you have it like that, alright?
On the whole, the game's weapons and armor give you more materia slots than the first game did, so there's just more that you can experiment with, which is nice. The downside with the materia system is that, well, the more you have, the more you have to manage. And this game really likes to force your party to split up during dungeons all the time, which I actually liked, but the further into the game you get, the more it becomes a pain to constantly have to unequip materia and re-equip materia again, moving them back and forth between party members. Any of y'all just as frustrated with not only how long the Temple of Ancients was, but also how they constantly had you switching between 2 different parties, which then meant I had to spend 20 minutes on the menu moving all of my best materia from the previous party back to the new party, and then back again when it switched back to the previous party. I suppose they could implement an option to save a particular materia configuration across a party, but if your party members change all the time, then there would just be too many different combinations of how you might configure your materia per party. Not to mention you'll gain new materia as the game progresses, which will in many cases render your particular configuration outdated. So yeah, I don't think that's a great solution. Honestly, I'm not sure what they could do to the UI to fix this problem, but it's hard to not notice this as a problem for the devs to look into for Part 3. And just as expected, the boss fights are all epic, broken up into multiple segments like it was in Remake. Of course, because the combat didn't change much from the first game, it doesn't have the same high impact because it's a bit of a known quantity at this point, but the combat was excellent in Remake, so I'm not going to complain. It's the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, the thing that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth truly did to improve the gameplay wasn't in the combat system at all. It was found in the planet itself, the exploration. When I first started playing the game, I was pretty impressed with Nibelheim visually in Chapter 1, but then the game transitions to the present day. In the middle of the night, Tifa asks Cloud if they could speak privately, so you follow her down the 2nd floor hall of the inn and out onto the rooftop terrace. This was the first moment the game took my breath away. Seeing the town of Calm and how immaculately designed it was, all lit up at night, I seriously couldn't believe how incredible it all looked and became even more eager to explore, wondering how much more there actually was. And you see, the devs were actually pretty smart here. This scene is not only important for narrative purposes, but they're intentionally teasing you with all that exploration, so you'll want to continue playing the game. I sort of expected prior to release that Calm would just be sort of like a circular plaza and maybe you could go inside the inn and that was it. But oh boy, it is so much more than that. Just look at this place. Look at all the little alleyways, the bridges, streams. They even added a big clock tower, which wasn't even found in the original game. Pretty sure that was Nomura's idea. He clearly has a thing for clock towers, and who can blame them? They're fucking cool, okay? I mean, in the modern world, they're kind of useless given how we have smartphones, smartwatches, PCs, video game consoles, ovens, toasters. Pretty much everything can tell time nowadays, and pretty soon we're gonna have brain chips implanted that will tell time so Big Brother can... The reason I expected Calm to be much simpler is because of how much content I knew this game had to cover. And so I figured that they were going to dial some of the detail in the towns back from Remake so that they could add more. So after spending like 2 hours just exploring Calm, I finally went out into the world. And again, I was not prepared for just how expansive the world actually was in this game. I was completely floored. I expected there to just be a sort of linear path from Calm to the Chocobo farm with a few branching pathways along the way, but Nope. This game was far more open than I had imagined it would ever be. And well, they call it the Grasslands, but they even added a mini region within the region for Midgar, and you can even travel on top of the highway for part of the way, all while the theme from Remake Hollow plays in the background. I figured all of that would be walled off, and granted you can't fully explore the Midgar region as part of it is gated off, but still, it's a hell of a lot more than I was expecting. And everywhere you turn, there's a shiny thing drawing your attention, whether it's an owl leading you to a life spring, summon crystals leading you to the next summon, bunny rabbits indicating there's buried treasure that you can snuff out with your chocobo, baby chocobos leading you to a rest station, Remna wave towers. It's not just that the game has a massive world to explore, but it's all densely packed with distractions everywhere you turn, that it's easy to accrue 10 to 20 hours in a given region, almost without even realizing you had put in that amount of time. So, after I finished exploring 100% of the Grasslands region, I finally moved on to the Mithril Mines, and it seemed it was all interconnected without any loading screens, which was impressive, and again, once I finished it, there was no loading screen on the other side when I reached the Junon region. So it had me wondering, is the entire game one giant seamless world, or were they just really good at masking the loading between regions? We'll get to that in a bit. But then I started exploring the Junon region, and once again, I'm dumbfounded that there was simply just so much to explore yet again. There's a whole area with shipwrecks to explore, which if you spend some time in Under Junon, you'll find that this makes sense given its history. If you listen to the NPCs, they'll tell you that Junon used to be a series of floating ships until the war happened and Shinra took over.
It was a large city with many people, built atop a series of connected ships called a flotilla.
And look at this! The dev team even produced concept art for what Junon used to look like before the war. But that's not all there is to explore. There's the mountainous section you need the Black Chocobo for, Kyrie has set up shop at a lighthouse, and there's even a separate smaller town not featured in the original game called the Crow's Nest. And then there's the main attraction itself, Junon. Under Junon looked incredible enough, but then I got to Upper Junon and I was flabbergasted yet again. This whole back alleyway section looks remarkable with all the fancy architectural designs inside this enclosed space, and there's a really neat looking bar with big glass panel windows overlooking the alley. Oh, hi Elena. Then there's the Bald Bar with Rude, which might be the goofiest shit I've seen in this game, and that's saying something because there'll be a lot of goofy shit in this game. I started to question, is every town in this game going to be this immaculate? And the answer is yes. Because then we get to ride a cruise ship, which was originally just a cargo ship in the original. They went above and beyond with Costa del Sol, the Gold Saucer. For fuck's sake, they didn't even cut corners with North Corel or Corel Prison. Gungaga got a complete makeover. Holy fuck. They turned this into this? Cosmo Canyon looks incredible with its multi-level design, and I love the cave-like inn they've got going on here. Then, after you've explored all the regions, you get access to the tiny Bronco, which allows you to travel across the sea, just like in the original. And you actually get to traverse the sea. It's not merely just a means to be able to fast travel to and from different regions. And this is where the game truly blew my mind. Everything that I had just explored was in fact all one seamless world. There are no separate zones in this game. And it's not just a different scaled replica of the world. No. It's the world itself. This was proven to me in a number of ways, but the one that really solidified it to me was when I was docking at Nibelheim's port. I noticed while riding the tiny Bronco that there were some treasure chests I missed and they were closed. So I went and got them, but the point is, those assets wouldn't just be hanging out there if this was just a replica of the world that it transitions to. It's all one and the same. So, considering it can take a long time to fully explore each region in the game, did I ever get bored exploring the world? Well, sorta. I loved it up until about the last region, which is the Nibel region. Now, if you've played the original game, you know that after Nibelheim is Rocket Town, which could have its own region, and then there's the northern continent with Bone Village, and I thought to myself, if they offer any more regions after Nibelheim, I'm probably gonna have to beeline the story, because I already had close to 100 hours by this point, and I knew there was still gonna be more late game content and side quests. So yeah, I really needed to finish the damn game. But when I began exploring Nibelheim, I ran into the Moogle house, and after completing the minigame there, I unlocked a trophy for completing all of them, which pretty much confirmed to me that this was the final region of the game. And as much as I would love Rocket Town and all that, I was actually okay with them skipping over it for this game. And maybe it's just me, but it feels like the Nibel region is the smallest region too, so it didn't take as long to fully explore as the others. It's almost as if the devs knew that people would probably tire of the game by this point if they kept it going any further, and were just like, alright, let's wrap this thing up, which this feeling also kind of matches up with the way the original Final Fantasy VII turned out, but I'll explain more about why that is later. Because the one thing that we have to talk about first are, of course, the minigames. Now, the original Final Fantasy VII was, of course, notorious for having lots of minigames, primarily due to the Gold Saucer, so it's no surprise that since we knew we were going to be visiting the Gold Saucer in this game, that there would of course be minigames. And even Final Fantasy VII Remake had some minigames in it. Remember Jules?
Show up. You're killing it!
You're crushing it! Just getting those gains.
However, oh boy, the minigames are everywhere in this game. Now, before even writing this review, I completely 100%ed the minigames, as in getting the highest rank on hard mode, even including that Cactuar Crush one. So, I played them. All of them. But even when I was at the end and hard mode versions opened up, there were so many minigames in this game that even when I thought I did them all, there were minigames I was missing because I forgot they were even in the game. I expected them to take the minigames up a notch, but maybe not to this extent. There are minigames in the main story, minigames in the side quests, minigames as part of world exploration, minigames as part of minigames. Like this Queen's Blood challenge, for instance. It's a minigame of the minigame. Or is Queen's Blood just the full game inside the fuller full game of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? I guess it's like a mini full game? A macro game? A macro minigame? A macaroni game? And sure, some of them suck, but many of them are actually very well put together. Some of them so well put together you start to question other video games Square Enix has put out. The Chocobo racing minigame in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is practically a full-on kart racer game. They put more effort into Chocobo racing in this game than they did into the entirety of Chocobo GP. So the question then becomes is it bad that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has this many minigames? Well, no, but also yes. The main minigame attraction in Final Fantasy VII is the Gold Saucer, but by the time I got there, I was already a bit burnt out on playing minigames. I did them all because I have OCD and feel like I have to, but because we just spent a whole lot of time doing minigames in Costa del Sol, it sort of lost its impact. And so you might say, well, you can just skip some of the minigames, and fair. But then I've heard some arguments that people have had against that, saying that they want to be able to get all of the ultimate gear and equipment, but they're not a fan of all the minigames, so they sort of get in the way of that. And fair, but really, I don't know that we can so easily discount the psychological impacts it has. Video games are, almost in their nature, for better or worse, a form of psychological manipulation, as is all entertainment if you think about it, and so carefully curating the content for a video game is important to consider. A player that chooses to engage with all of the game's side content but finds it mediocre will walk away with a different overall impression than a person who only completed the main story and chose not to engage in extra side content. It's maybe one of the hardest things for game developers to balance. It's certainly better that the game have too much optional content than be devoid of content.
Be engulfed by the pool.
And don't get me wrong, most of the minigames make the game better more than it makes it worse. Having too much optional content is something most players would find acceptable, but maybe not optimal. One of the ways that the optional content can make a video game less enjoyable is it can affect the pacing and immersion of the main content, which I would put in the category of a good problem to have. Which sort of brings me to the next thing we need to talk about, which we haven't yet, and that's the game's story. But first, we have to talk a little about my issue with the original Final Fantasy VII. I remember back when Square Enix first announced that they were going to be splitting Final Fantasy VII Remake up into multiple parts. My mind instantly started to think, it's probably going to be a trilogy, so I tried to think about how best to split Final Fantasy VII into 3 parts. And the most difficult part to decide was actually where the first game would end. Final Fantasy VII is on average about 30 to 40 hours of playtime for most people on their first playthrough, and Midgar is roughly 4 to 5 hours of playtime. So you might think that that would only account for 10% of the game. But things are far more complex than that, because even though it only takes 4 or 5 hours to play, doesn't mean that it covers 10% of the plot. In fact, it's probably closer to maybe 25% of all the written dialogue. But Midgar and Shinra are so core to the story of Final Fantasy VII that the weight and significance it carries is probably equal to a third of the game's plot. Not to mention it has its own sort of complete arc that could make for a finale to one singular game. However, when examining where the second game should end, the only logical place that would make sense is to end the game after Aerith dies at the City of the Ancients. So that would leave a whole lot of places to explore. So much so that it didn't seem feasible to put all in one game. So it seemed to me that the most compelling way to tell the story would be to end the first game after Midgar, but that wasn't where I thought Square Enix would actually end the game. I thought that they would go up to the cargo ship where you fight Jenova for the first time and make that essentially the final boss of Game 1, just so that they could get through more of the game's story. But I was wrong. Square Enix actually gave me what I wanted, with Midgar being a whole entry in the trilogy. So let's dig a bit deeper as to why City of the Ancients / Aerith's death is the only logical place to end Game 2. Well, because outside of Junon, there really isn't much happening in the plot, and Junon would be too early in the plot to end the second game, of course. For this entire section of the game, you're basically just looking for Sephiroth, and you go from town to town, and you get a lot of the characters' different backstories along the way, but the overall pacing kinda dips a bit. It's not that the Gold Saucer isn't fun, or that finding out about Barrett's or Red 13's past isn't super interesting, or even that the locales you explore aren't creative. All of those parts are very interesting on their own merits, but the game sorta turns you away from the central plot a bit, and it takes a long while to get back to it. All of these parts you do from the cargo ship up until the City of the Ancients are mostly diversions. From my experience knowing people who have played Final Fantasy VII for the first time, they often stop playing around Nibelheim in present day because the game is just not retaining their attention by that point. And it's not even necessarily that they hated the game or even disliked it or even claimed that they quit. They just sort of stopped playing and then maybe never came back to it, or didn't do so until months later. So if there were issues with the pacing in this section of the original game, you can see how I might be concerned with how they handle the story in Rebirth, considering the fact that we're essentially blowing this section of the game to an entire full-length game. How are they going to keep it interesting all the way through, and will they move stuff around to better retain attention as you explore this massive section of the world? So, did Square Enix handle it well? Well, we'll get to that. First, let's talk about the positive aspects of the game's story, the changes. I will admit that right in the first chapter, I was getting a little bored halfway through because it was mostly in line with the original plot, and this was to be expected. Cloud acting as an unreliable narrator and telling the backstory of how Sephiroth eventually becomes a villain is so integral to the plot of Final Fantasy VII that they really can't change much. However, one of the things that I loved about what they did change in this section is how they made the entire town of Nibelheim look up to Sephiroth, almost as if he was a celebrity.
I'm eager to talk to him too, but now's not the time. Don't make any trouble for Sephiroth.
You can see crowds of people hoarded around outside the town hall, hoping for even a chance to get to see Sephiroth. And this makes sense given Sephiroth is known to be one of the best, if not the best, soldiers in Shinra. And this really makes you feel for the people of Nibelheim when he burns it down at the end. The very same person that they looked up to and trusted turned their back on them and basically murdered them all. It's dark as hell, but even more reason to love it. And of course, in the original Final Fantasy VII, Yuffie was an optional character, so naturally, I was curious as to how they would integrate her character into this game, and I thought they did it perfectly. This time, she's tasked with the assassination of Rufus Shinra, and what better way to do it than during his coronation, where he makes a public appearance, and since the party is already there caught up with the event in their own way, it creates the perfect opportunity for them to cross paths. But it's also even more than that. It accentuates the tension between Shinra and Wutai even more, piling onto the stack they began building with Remake. And I just gotta say that Rufus firing the cannon in Junon was also a nice addition that serves the same purpose. I love how Heidegger was just like,
if you do this, you're basically signaling to Wutai you want war.
and Rufus is over here just like,
That's exactly why I want to do it, motherfucker.
Even a ceremonial display would constitute a violation of the ceasefire. Wutai would view it as a willful act of aggression.
And
the other optional character from the original was Vincent, and even though he isn't playable in this game, I loved how they turned that section into Nibelheim into a boss fight. Before Rebirth's release, I somehow didn't even think about that, but once I got to Nibelheim, I started to realize that could be the direction they take this part. And it's perfect because he can already transform into monsters, so they could theoretically just turn his Galleon form into a boss fight, right? And then it actually happened. So that was cool. However, I have to say that his reasoning for tagging along afterwards is a bit weak. So he wants to join Cloud in the gang just because Cloud mentioned he wanted to defeat Sephiroth. I mean, I guess it's okay, but maybe I feel it's somehow off because, well, why would the party trust him at this point? I mean, he did mention he was a former Turk, and he did literally just try to kill them, so I guess they're okay with it? If you had never played the original Final Fantasy VII, you would probably think it was really weird that he joins you back on the tiny Bronco. It felt a bit forced. But then when they were trying to decipher the location of the Temple of the Ancients, I did think it was clever how they used his history with the Turks to pick up on the radio wave signals to listen in on their conversation, uncovering the temple's location. So I'm a bit torn because he does contribute to advancing the plot in a meaningful way, but also doesn't really make sense that our party trusts him so easily. Cid's inclusion, however, was handled well in my opinion. I mean, in the original, he has this little plane called the Tiny Bronco that's meant to fly, but only flies for a short while before it goes bust and turns into a glorified ship. So it makes sense that before you would meet him in his hometown that he could have a business called Bronco Airlines, where he flies people to and from various locations. And what better way than to use it as a fast travel system across the various regions of the world. And his reason for sticking with the party beyond his business's venture is because he has some kind of a deep connection to Ifalna, Aerith's mom, which is interesting. You could say that this just feels like a bit of a cop-out, but we'll have to wait until we play part 3 to make the final judgment on it. It certainly has my interest piqued, as it will give Cid more of a reason to participate in the events that unfold at Icicle Inn, as that's where a lot of Ifalna's backstory is discussed, as well as add even more weight to it. And that's one of the things that I liked about Rebirth, was that almost every story mission forced all of the characters to participate in some way. And sure, it often comes at the sacrifice of being able to freely choose your party members, but you still get to choose your characters freely during all the world exploration segments in between the chapter missions, so it works. This was one of the big problems with the original Final Fantasy VII, and really a lot of the older JRPGs in general of that era, is that often once a character joins your party, they essentially stop being an integral part of the story after that, because it's hard to construct dialogue for them if you get to freely choose which characters to tag along with you. They would resort to just having little one-liners and cutscenes, but they never really enhanced the story much. This methodology, though, works, and I loved getting to see the characters interact with each other more intimately, especially the goofy relationship between Barret and Red 13. And speaking of Red 13, while I liked his character overall, they made kind of a weird decision with his character. You see, he starts out as this wise creature filled with knowledge of the planet, and his deep voice reflects this perfectly.
Without your help, I'd still be in Hojo's clutches, trapped in that lab.
But then, once you get to Cosmo Canyon, you discover that for his species, he's actually really young, and most of his knowledge just comes from Grandpa Bugenhagen. It's at this point in the story that his voice changes, and now he kind of sounds like Simba from The Lion King.
A thing or two? I doubt there's a thing or two you don't know about it.
Ow! Jeez, what was that for?
But then his voice almost permanently changes to that. And not just that, but he actually acts different as well. He's no longer the party's guide and acts like a naive kid. And I say almost because there are some moments where he embodies his older sounding voice and acts wise, but for the most part he continues to act more like a kid.
How about it? Wanna hear?
Yeah, why not?
Gather round and hearken to my tale.
I don't mind either version of the character individually. It's the lack of consistency that is very off-putting to me. His split personality creates a bit of narrative dissonance. And by the way, shout out to Max Middleman, who plays both versions of Red 13 and nailed both voices. Also, shout out to pretty much all of the voice actors, as they all did a great job in this game. Really great performances across the board. So the other character we need to talk about is Clody. Oh yes, we're going there. For those that don't know, Clody is a term the fanbase came up with to indicate the shipping between Cloud and Tifa. And Clearith is the term people use to indicate shipping between Cloud and Aerith. Is it dumb? Of course it is. But there are definitely people that are upset about the fact that the game's plot is very clearly indicating that Tifa is meant to be Cloud's love interest and Aerith is not. There may have been evidence of this in Remake, but it's pretty clear that this is the direction they wanted to go with here in Rebirth. Right from the very beginning, when Cloud and Tifa have a bit of an intimate dispute in regards to their memories of the past, to the clear focus of their intimacy at the inn in Junon, all the way to their moment at Gungaga, which brings me to talk about Gungaga next. First off, oh boy, I was not expecting this place to get the makeover it did. I mean, this was just a pit stop on the way to Cosmo Canyon in the original game. Now, it's its own full-blown chapter of the game with its own region to explore. And Cisne from Crisis Core is in this game. So, does that mean Genesis could be in Part 3?
Even if the morrow is barren of promises, nothing shall forestall my return.
Some of y'all aren't gonna like that if that's the case. Anyway, it seems some weapons are running rampant at an old destroyed reactor, which, by the way, I think it was great how they integrated the weapons into this game. When they first mentioned weapons in the trailer for this game, I simply thought that it was a simulation of them in the planetarium at Cosmo Canyon, and that they wouldn't be in this game as it's too early for the planet weapons to appear. And I was kinda right, but mostly wrong. The giant weapons from the original game aren't in Rebirth, so that's true. What they did instead, though, was introduce these mini weapons in this game, which will certainly feel like stepping stones towards the gigantic weapons that will inevitably appear in Part 3. So Cloud, Barret, Red 13, and Kate Sith, the boys, or the boys and animals, I guess, go to investigate the rundown Mako reactor, and they get into some trouble. So then the rest of the party has to catch up with them. Which, by the way, I will commend them on good level design here. They found a way to make the same dungeon traversable, but in a different way with the use of the grappling hooks. This is also something they largely improved from Remake, are these dungeon level designs. Much more engaging this time with small puzzles and interactable environments. That aside, the end of this section is where things get interesting. Cloud basically gets controlled by Genova, and then goes apeshit, needlessly murdering a bunch of Shinra soldiers. Tifa tries to stop him, but he's too far gone, and he ends up slicing Tifa underneath the
booba.
Kinda reminiscent of how Sephiroth sliced her years ago at the Nibelheim reactor. She then begins to fall into the Mako-infused spring, only to be swallowed up by a planetary weapon. The game then transitions to a livestream sequence, which again is a tease for something that's coming in Part 3. And in here, we get some flashbacks of Tifa's memories, as well as an insight into what's going on in the planet. We now know that there are essentially good Whispers and bad Whispers. The good Whispers are white and are working in tandem with the weapons trying to protect the planet, and the bad Whispers are the black ones controlled by Sephiroth. Eventually, after this little sequence is over, the weapon returns Tifa back to reality, and you would think that Tifa should be mad at Cloud. I mean, he practically almost killed her, but no. And at first, I thought that this moment was bad writing, until she explains a memory that she uncovered during her visit to the livestream from the sequence earlier. That memory revealed the true nature of Cloud. He actually tried to stop her from getting into danger years ago when they were children. So as soon as Cloud seemingly let her down, she was reminded of why he's actually a good person, and that it's not his fault for the way he acts from time to time. It's because of evil forces possessing him. She knows that he cares deep down, and so despite the fact that she almost lost her life because of him, and despite the fact that Cloud is incredibly messed up as a person, she continues to give him unwavering support. The history they have together was present even in the original game, and why I always thought that they were actually meant to be the couple. And this moment at Gongaga really solidified this. Aerith, on the other hand, never really interacted with the true Cloud in the way that Tifa has memories of interacting with him. So all the people that thought Cloud and Aerith should be together can shove it up there. But this moment wasn't just important for deepening Cloud and Tifa's relationship. It goes back to the pacing problem that the original game had. This section at Gongaga kinda escalates things. It deepens your understanding of the threat Sephiroth poses to the planet. It escalates Cloud's struggle to maintain control over his psyche. It escalates Cloud and Tifa's bond, and this is important because that's exactly what the game needed at this point in time. Prior to this, you spend time having fun, feeling like you're on a vacation, going from the cruise ship to Costa del Sol and to the Gold Saucer, where practically all you do is play minigames, and sure, you get Barrett's backstory, which was very well done, and also helps to characterize the greed of Shinra, but you become too distant from the central conflict that's actually supposed to be going on. And so if you just continued on a Cosmo Canyon with Red 13's backstory, it would really get tiresome. This moment at Gongaga kind of reels you back into the real reasons you're on this adventure to begin with, to defeat Sephiroth and save the planet. Now, is the story overall as interesting as Remake? I personally don't think so, to be honest. Even with this section, at the end of the day, not a whole lot of turn of events really happen in this game. You're basically just looking for Sephiroth the whole game, and most of what's going on is just a tease for what's to come in Part 3. There's no seriously climactic event like the plate falling on Sector 7 from Remake to be found here in Rebirth, but I've got to give the developers credit where it's due. They did as good a job as they could have done with the source material they were working with, and I'll be damned if I wasn't entertained throughout the experience. Everywhere you turn, they just went the extra mile, going above and beyond my expectations. There are so many things we didn't cover. So many cool moments in this game that I couldn't possibly talk about in this review, or it would be a 2-hour review. Like how they involved Cait Sith's character more, and even this little hint that Reeve is controlling Cait Sith as you see his backup Cait Sith 2 doll sitting in the background of this shot. How they integrated Guy, which is basically just an enemy in Cosmo Canyon in the original game, into an important aspect of the game's lore involving the Black Materia. I didn't even really touch on Zack, for crying out loud, which by the way, his parts also help to keep the mystery of the central plot going and improve the pacing of the story overall. So at the end of the day, no, I don't think it's as good as Remake per se, but as I said before, Remake is my favorite video game of all time. Rebirth had kind of an impossible standard to live up to right from the beginning. Remake was exciting because it came at a time when I thought Final Fantasy games just couldn't be excellent anymore, and, well, it shocked the hell out of me. It invented this new hybrid action command-based battle system. It established a new graphical look, epic multi-part boss fights, a new way of arranging all these classic iconic songs from the original mixed with new iconic scores of its own. Rebirth builds upon all of these things, but it's just impossible to capture the magic of seeing all of this stuff for the first time, even if the game improves upon everything the first game did. Now, as I mentioned, Rebirth didn't necessarily improve upon the storytelling, but it did improve upon the gameplay and exploration in spades. And the fact that the game managed to provide a giant seamless world without sacrificing all of the cinematic elements of the first game and still contains essentially just as many cutscenes and story sequences is an absolute milestone for Final Fantasy as a series, in my opinion. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a monumental achievement as a video game, period. And it will still go down as being one of the most memorable video games I've ever played. But there's something we still didn't talk about, and that's the ending. But don't worry, we will talk about it in a later video, so if you didn't already subscribe from earlier, then what are you doing? I mean, you made it all the way to the end of this video. Hit that subscribe button so you'll know when I upload my ending video. And while you're at it, if you like this video, you should consider checking out my Rediscover Final Fantasy series, as it's very similar in nature, by watching this video right here.